Blood rushed to her head, blurring the dusty frontier town into a dizzying smear of brown and gray. For 7 consecutive days, Olivia endured the rope, suspended between life and death. The town watched her break, but they didn't watch the tree line, because out there, the mountain man was watching them. The year was 1874, and the town of Oakhaven, Colorado Territory, was a place where God's light rarely penetrated the dense canopy of the surrounding pines. It was a timber and mining settlement, built on mud, blood, and the ruthless ambitions of men who valued a dollar far more than a human life. And no man embodied the rot of Oakhaven quite like Josiah Crabb. Olivia Miller had never intended to be a martyr. She was 24, with hands calloused from working the soil and eyes the color of a summer storm. Her father, Thomas Miller, had staked the finest claim in the valley, the Whispering Pines Ranch, a sprawling tract of land that sat directly over a newly discovered vein of silver. When Thomas was found dead at the bottom of a ravine, the local law ruled it a tragic riding accident. Olivia knew better. Her father had been an expert horseman. He had been murdered. Within a week of his burial, Josiah Crabb, the wealthy baron who owned Oakhaven's saloon, its bank, and the sheriff's badge, produced a deed. The document claimed Thomas had signed away the ranch to clear a gambling debt. It was a blatant forgery, but in Oakhaven, Crabb's word was the law. Olivia didn't weep. She fought. In the dead of night, she broke into Crabb's office above the saloon to steal the forged deed, intending to ride to the federal marshal in Denver. But Crabb's men had been waiting. They caught her, beat her, and dragged her into the muddy street. Josiah Crabb could have easily shot her and buried her next to her father. But Crabb was a man who delighted in psychological destruction. He needed the town to see what happened to those who defied him. More importantly, he needed Olivia to sign a confession of theft and a legal transfer of the deed in front of Judge Harmon to make the theft of her land airtight. Break the spirit, Crabb told his lead enforcer, a hulking brute named Cletus, and the hand will gladly sign. Thus began the agonizing spectacle that would forever scar the history of Oakhaven. Every afternoon at exactly 4 o'clock, Cletus and 2 other men would drag Olivia to the massive, dead sycamore tree that stood like a skeletal warning at the edge of town. They bound her ankles with heavy, coarse hemp rope, threw the line over a thick branch, and hoisted her up until she hung upside down, 4 feet off the unforgiving dirt. They left her there until the sun fully dipped behind the jagged peaks of the Rockies. The physical torture was beyond anything Olivia could have comprehended. Within minutes of being hoisted up, the blood would pool in her head, causing a terrifying, rhythmic pounding behind her eyes. Her vision would swim, turning the world into a red-tinted, inverted nightmare. The coarse rope tore through her woolen stockings, biting deep into the flesh of her ankles, leaving them raw and bleeding. Her lungs struggled against the unnatural gravity, making every breath a shallow, gasping effort. The first day, she screamed. She cursed Crabb, calling him a murderer and a thief, her voice echoing off the wooden facades of the general store and the blacksmith's forge. But the townspeople merely averted their eyes. Doc Boone, the town's alcoholic physician, watched from the window of his clinic, a bottle trembling in his hand, too cowardly to intervene. Mrs. Higgins, the baker, hurried her children inside and locked the door. Fear was a thicker chain than iron, and Crabb had the entire town bound in it. By the 4th day, the screaming had stopped. Olivia conserved her energy just to stay conscious. The evenings were the worst. As the sun lowered, the temperature plummeted, the biting mountain wind chilling her sweat-soaked clothes. Then came the coyotes. Emboldened by the dusk, they would creep out from the brush, drawn by the scent of her blood. They circled her, snapping their jaws inches from her dangling face. She had to violently swing her arms and shout with whatever breath she had left to keep them at bay, the effort sending fresh waves of agony through her suspended body. On the 7th day, a Friday, Olivia felt her resolve fracturing. Her face was severely swollen, her lips cracked, her eyes bloodshot to the point of being entirely crimson. As Cletus lowered her down at dusk, she collapsed into the mud, unable to feel her legs. "Just sign the paper, Abby," Cletus sneered, casually spitting tobacco juice near her cheek. "Mr. Crabb's losing his patience. Tomorrow, we might just leave you up there when the wolves come down. Olivia stared at the mud, her breath rattling in her chest. She closed her eyes. She didn't know if she could survive an 8th day. She prayed for an end, either a swift death or a miracle. She didn't know that a miracle had just ridden into Oakhaven, smelling of pine needles, wood smoke, and imminent violence. Adrian Gideon did not belong to the world of towns, saloons, or forged deeds. He was a creature of the high altitudes, a mountain man who had spent the last decade trapping, hunting, and surviving in the brutal, unforgiving expanse of the Wind River Range. Standing 6'3", Adrian was a man carved from the wilderness. He wore a heavy coat of cured buffalo hide, fringed buckskin trousers, and carried a .50 caliber Sharps rifle that he treated with more reverence than most men treated their wives. A jagged, pale scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, a souvenir from a grizzly bear that hadn't survived the encounter. He spoke rarely, trusted no one, and only came down to the flatlands twice a year to trade his pelts for coffee, flour, ammunition, and salt. Adrian rode into Oakhaven on a massive, draft-cross gelding named Brimstone. It was late afternoon. He tied his horse outside Elias Thorne's mercantile, completely ignoring the strange, oppressive silence that seemed to suffocate the town. As he hauled a bundle of prime beaver pelts onto his broad shoulder, a commotion at the edge of town caught his eye. Adrian paused, his ice-blue eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his weathered slouch hat. Down the street, a crowd had gathered at a safe distance from the old sycamore tree. He watched as 3 men roughly hauled a woman in a torn, muddy dress toward the trunk. He watched them bind her ankles. He watched them heave on the rope, pulling her upside down into the air. Adrian stood frozen. The sheer, unnatural cruelty of the act struck him like a physical blow. He had seen men do terrible things in the wilderness. He had participated in the brutal calculus of survival, but this was different. This was theater. This was a sick, calculated torture meant to humiliate. He stepped into the mercantile, dropping his pelts on the wooden counter with a heavy thud. Elias, the balding storekeeper, jumped, his eyes darting nervously toward the street outside. "What's the going rate for prime winter beaver?" Adrian asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. Elias swallowed hard. $2 a pelt, Mr. Gideon. Same as last spring. Adrian didn't blink. He tilted his head toward the window. "Who's the woman?" Elias went pale. He aggressively scrubbed the counter with a dirty rag, refusing to look out the glass. "You don't want to involve yourself in that, Adrian. That's Olivia Miller. She crossed Josiah Crabb. Stole from him. Or so the sheriff says." "She looks like she's dying," Adrian stated flatly. "She will if she don't sign over her daddy's ranch," Elias whispered, leaning in close. "Crabb hangs her up there every day. It's a terrible thing. But Crabb owns this town. You cross him, you end up in a pine box. Just take your flour and beans, Adrian. Head back up the mountain. It ain't your fight." Adrian stared at the storekeeper for a long, silent moment. Memories he had buried deep beneath the snow and soil clawed at the edges of his mind. A lifetime ago, before the mountains claimed him, he had a younger sister. She had been wronged by powerful men in a Missouri river town, and the locals had turned a blind eye. Adrian had been too young, too weak to stop them then. The guilt had driven him into isolation, turning him into a ghost haunting the high ridges. He looked back out the window. The woman Olivia was suspended, her long brown hair hanging down toward the dirt. He saw the subtle shudder of her body as she fought for breath. He saw the unbroken defiance in her swollen, bloodshot eyes before the pain forced them shut. "We'll do $2.50 a pelt, Elias," Adrian said quietly. "And you're going to throw in a box of Winchester rounds and a fresh canteen." Elias nodded frantically, eager to get the intimidating mountain man out of his store. Adrian packed his supplies onto Brimstone. He didn't ride back toward the mountain pass. Instead, he led his horse to a dense thicket of pines about a half-mile outside of Oakhaven, out of sight but with a clear view of the dead sycamore. He sat against a tree, pulled a piece of pemmican from his pouch, and began to clean his hunting knife. He waited. The sun bled orange and purple across the sky before finally sinking behind the peaks. The shadows lengthened. Adrian watched as Cletus and his men returned to the tree. But tonight, they didn't lower her. "We're leaving you up a little longer tonight, Abby." Cletus's voice drifted on the night wind, thick with cruel amusement. "Mister, Crab wants you to appreciate the dark. We'll be at the saloon. Yell if the coyotes start biting your fingers off." The men laughed and walked away, the glow of their cigars fading into the darkness. Olivia was left alone, hanging in the pitch black. She was shivering uncontrollably now, her body reaching the absolute limits of its endurance. The throbbing in her head was blinding. She heard the snap of a twig nearby. A low growl vibrated in the brush. The coyotes were early. Tears finally leaked from her eyes, rolling up her forehead and dripping into her hair. "Please," she whispered to the empty night. "Please, God, let it end." Suddenly, the rustling in the brush stopped. The low growl turned into a sharp yelp, followed by the sound of something heavy dragging through the dirt. Then, absolute silence. Olivia tried to twist her body, panic spiking in her chest. Had a mountain lion come down? Footsteps approached. They were heavy, deliberate, yet entirely silent on the dry leaves. A shadow detached itself from the darkness, towering and impossibly broad. Olivia gasped, trying to scream, but her throat was completely dry. A gloved hand, rough and smelling of leather and gun oil, clamped gently over her mouth. Quiet. A deep voice rumbled beside her ear. It wasn't a threat. It was a command, grounded in absolute calm. "I'm going to cut you down. Do not scream, or you'll bring them out of the saloon." Olivia's eyes went wide. She nodded frantically against his hand. The shadow moved. She felt a massive arm wrap around her waist, taking her weight with astonishing ease. Then, the sound of a blade slicing through thick hemp. The violent release of tension sent a shockwave through her body. As gravity reasserted its proper hold, the blood rushed furiously from her head back down to her extremities. The sudden shift caused her to black out for a fraction of a second. When she opened her eyes, she was lying on the ground, cradled against a heavy buffalo hide coat. The world was spinning. She retched violently, coughing up nothing but bile and dust. The man knelt beside her, unscrewing a metal canteen. He supported the back of her neck with a massive hand and tipped the water to her cracked lips. Sip, slowly. Olivia drank, the water feeling like liquid ice on her throat. As her vision cleared, the moonlight caught her savior's face. He was rugged, scarred, and possessed an intensity that terrified and grounded her all at once. "Who?" she croaked, her voice barely a rasp. "Who are you?" "My name is Adrian," he said, wiping the dirt from her forehead with a surprisingly gentle thumb. "Can you walk?" Olivia tried to move her legs. Fresh agony flared in her ankles where the rope had dug into the bone. She shook her head, tears of frustration welling in her eyes. "No, they're numb. They'll kill you for this. Crab's men. They'll kill us both." Adrian Gideon stood, easily lifting Olivia into his arms as if she weighed no more than a bundle of kindling. He looked toward the glow of the saloon down the street, his scarred face hardening into a mask of pure, cold stone. "Let them try," the mountain man whispered into the dark. He turned and carried her into the trees, leaving the severed rope swinging empty in the wind, a silent declaration of war. The ascent was brutal, a vertical climb through dense switchbacks and jagged shale that would have broken a lesser horse. But Brimstone was bred for the high country, and Adrian Gideon led the massive gelding with the sure-footed grace of a phantom. Olivia lay draped across the saddle, wrapped tightly in Adrian's heavy buffalo coat, drifting in and out of a feverish consciousness. Every jolt sent a spike of white-hot pain through her mangled ankles, but the terror that had gripped her for a week was slowly being replaced by a profound, surreal sense of safety. The scent of pine resin and the raw, earthy musk of the mountain man walking beside her tethered her to the living world. Hours before dawn, they reached a hidden plateau near the timberline. Tucked beneath an overhang of granite was a sturdy, low-slung cabin built from unpeeled logs and chinked with mud. It was completely invisible from the valley floor, a fortress of solitude Adrian had built years ago. Adrian carried Olivia inside, laying her gently on a bed of thick furs over a rope-strung frame. He struck a match, lighting a kerosene lantern that cast a warm, flickering amber glow across the single room. The walls were lined with traps, stretched pelts, and jars of dried herbs. "Drink this," Adrian commanded softly, lifting her head and holding a tin cup to her lips. It was water mixed with a bitter powder, willow bark. "It will break the fever and dull the pain." Olivia swallowed the concoction, her throat raw. She watched through half-open eyes as Adrian knelt at the foot of the bed. He pulled a sharp hunting knife from his belt. For a brief second, the trauma of the past week flared, her breath catching in her chest. But Adrian didn't look at her with malice. His ice-blue eyes held only clinical focus. With surgical precision, he sliced through the ruined woolen stockings fused to her skin by dried blood and dirt. Olivia hissed in agony as the fabric peeled away, revealing deep, dark, purple grooves chewed into her flesh by the hemp rope. "The bone is bruised, but not broken," Adrian muttered, his rough fingers probing the joints with surprising tenderness. He moved to a small iron stove, heating a pot of water and mixing a dark green poultice from crushed yarrow and pine sap. Crabsmen are butchers, but they were lazy. A few more days, gangrene would have set in. As he carefully applied the warm, stinging paste and wrapped her legs in clean linen, Olivia finally found her voice. It was a raspy whisper, but it carried the weight of her surviving spirit. "Why?" she asked, her stormy eyes locking onto his scarred face. "Oakhaven is a graveyard for anyone who crosses Josiah Crabbe. You don't know me, mister. You could have been killed." Adrian didn't answer immediately. He finished tying the bandages, then sat back in a heavy wooden chair beside the stove, picking up his .50 caliber Sharps rifle. He pulled an oil rag from his pocket and began running it over the blued steel barrel. "A long time ago, in a river town back in Missouri," Adrian began, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that filled the cabin. "I had a sister, name of Sarah. Some men with money and badges decided they owned her. The town stood by and watched it happen. I was a boy, too small, too scared to pull a trigger." He paused, his jaw tightening, making the ragged scar on his cheek pull taut. "I swore to God I'd never watch a pack of wolves tear apart a lamb again. Not if I had a rifle and the breath to fire it." Olivia felt a lump form in her throat. She reached out, her trembling, calloused hand resting on his thick forearm. "I am no lamb, Adrian, but I thank you." "Crabbe will tear the valley apart looking for us," Adrian stated, meeting her gaze. "He can't let this go, not after you humiliated him by surviving." "He needs the deed to Whispering Pines," Olivia said, her mind suddenly clearing as the willow bark took effect. "My father, Thomas, wasn't a fool. When they found that silver vein, he knew Crabbe would come for it. Crabbe's local deed is a clumsy forgery. The real document, the federal land patent, stamped by the General Land Office and signed by President Grant himself, isn't in Oakhaven." Adrian raised an eyebrow. "Where is it?" "Denver," Olivia replied, a spark of dangerous hope igniting in her chest. "It's in a lockbox at the Federal Assay Office, held by an old friend of my father's, Ezekiel Cross. If I can get to a telegraph office and wire Ezekiel, or if I can reach the U.S. Marshal, Crabbe's empire turns to dust. He'll hang for murder and claim jumping." Adrian looked out the small grease paper window. The sky was turning a bruised purple, signaling the dawn. Oakhaven controls the only telegraph line for 50 miles, and the pass to Denver will be snowed in within the week. If we're going to break Crabbe, we can't run. We have to go back down. "I can't walk," Olivia said, the frustration evident in her voice. "You won't have to." Adrian replied, chambering a massive brass cartridge into the Sharps rifle with a heavy metallic clack. "But first, we have to survive the hunting party, because by now, they've found the rope." Down in Oakhaven, the morning air was shattered by the sound of breaking glass. Josiah Crabbe hurled a whiskey bottle through the window of his saloon, his face purple with rage. Standing before him in the muddy street was Cletus, holding the severed end of the thick hemp rope. The dead sycamore tree stood empty behind him. "You left her completely unguarded?" Crab roared, spit flying from his lips. He was a wealthy man who dressed in tailored Eastern suits, but right now the polished veneer had cracked, revealing the ruthless thug beneath. "She was half dead, boss," Cletus stammered, stepping back. "And it wasn't no townie that did this. We found tracks, a draft horse, big one, and a boot print near the tree that belongs to a mountain man. Adrian Gideon rode into town yesterday afternoon." "I don't care if it was the devil himself," Crab shouted, drawing a pearl-handled Colt revolver and pressing it hard into Cletus's chest. "That girl is the only thing standing between me and $1 million in silver. If she gets to a federal judge, we are all dead men. You take 10 men. You take the tracker, Blackjack Boyd. You ride up that mountain, and you bring me Olivia Miller's head. And bring me the mountain man's scalp while you're at it." By noon, a heavily armed posse of 11 men rode out of Oakhaven, their breath pluming in the freezing air. They were a collection of cutthroats, rustlers, and hired guns, heavily motivated by the $500 gold bounty Crab had placed on the fugitives. Up at the Eagle's Roost, the weather was turning. A bitter wind howled through the limestone crags, bringing the first heavy flurries of a mountain blizzard. Adrian was outside, methodically chopping firewood. He knew the terrain intimately. He knew there was only one navigable trail up to the plateau, a narrow, treacherous gorge known as Devil's Throat. Inside the cabin, Olivia was out of bed. Using a sturdy pine branch Adrian had carved into a crutch, she hobbled around the small room, testing her weight. The pain was still blinding, but her sheer force of will kept her upright. She found Adrian's spare weapon on a shelf, a well-oiled Colt Navy revolver. She checked the cylinder, finding it fully loaded, and tucked it into the waistband of her skirts. She had hunted elk with her father. She knew how to shoot, and she refused to be helpless again. Suddenly, Adrian stepped into the cabin, bringing a gust of freezing wind with him. His face was grim. "They're in the gorge," he said quietly, grabbing a canvas bandolier of heavy cartridges and slinging it over his broad shoulder. 11 riders. They pushed their horses hard to beat the snow. "Can we hold them off?" Olivia asked, gripping the crutch tightly. "I won't let them near the cabin," Adrian said, moving to the door. "Stay inside. Keep away from the window." Adrian vanished into the whiteout conditions. He didn't take Brimstone. On foot, in the rocks and the snow, the mountain man was a ghost. Down in Devil's Throat, the posse was struggling. The horses were skittish, slipping on the icy shale. Blackjack Boyd, a wiry man with a face like tanned leather, rode at the front, reading the faint indentations in the dirt. "Tracks lead straight up the chute, Cletus," Boyd called back over the howling wind, "but it's a bottleneck. Perfect place for an ambush." "Just keep moving!" Cletus barked, shivering in his wool coat. A deafening boom echoed through the canyon, a sound like a thunderclap that physically shook the rocks. Before the echo could fade, the man riding next to Cletus was violently thrown from his saddle, a gaping hole punched straight through his chest by a half-inch lead slug. The horses panicked, rearing and bucking in the narrow space. "Sniper!" Boyd screamed, diving from his horse behind a boulder. High above, hidden in a cleft of rock 400 yards away, Adrian worked the lever of his sharps. The brass casing ejected into the snow with a hiss. He slid another round into the breach. He wasn't shooting randomly. He was using the devastating power of the buffalo rifle to pin them in the kill zone. He fired again. Boom! Another rider went down, his horse bolting back down the trail. "Return fire! Return fire!" Cletus roared, blindly emptying his Winchester up into the blinding snow. Bullets chipped the limestone far below Adrian's position. For 20 minutes, Adrian held them in a terrifying state of siege. He picked off 2 more men who tried to break cover. But the snow was falling thicker now, reducing visibility to a few dozen yards. Adrian knew the advantage of the sharps was gone. He drew his heavy hunting knife and a pair of Colt revolvers, slipping down from his perch to engage them in the brush. Through the chaos and the snowblind, Cletus and Blackjack Boyd realized the firing from above had stopped. "He's moving!" Boyd hissed. "He's coming down to flank us! You 3, keep shooting at the rocks!" "Cletus, You and me are going to climb the scree and get to that cabin. If we grab the girl, the mountain man will surrender." While Adrian stalked the remaining men in the lower brush, engaging in brutal, close-quarters combat that left the snow stained red, Cletus and Boyd managed to slip past his perimeter. They climbed the treacherous back route, their lungs burning in the thin air, until the shape of the cabin emerged through the blizzard. Inside, Olivia heard the crunch of boots on the snow just outside the door. She knew it wasn't Adrian. His footsteps were never that heavy. She retreated to the darkest corner of the cabin, leveling the Colt Navy at the heavy wooden door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The door violently burst open, splintering off its hinges as Cletus kicked it in. Boyd rushed in behind him, a shotgun raised. Well, Cletus sneered, spotting her in the shadows. He wiped melting snow from his face, grinning a yellow-toothed smile. "Look at the little bird. Broken wings and all." "Take another step, Cletus, and I'll put a bullet through your eye," Olivia warned, her voice remarkably steady, her finger tightening on the trigger. Cletus laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You ain't got the nerve, Abby. You're a rancher's daughter, not a killer. Now put the iron down before Boyd here takes your legs off with buckshot." Boyd took a step forward. Olivia didn't hesitate. She didn't flinch. The trauma of the rope, the memory of her murdered father, and the sheer will to survive culminated in a single, decisive action. She pulled the trigger. The heavy revolver bucked violently in her hands. The roar filled the small cabin. Blackjack Boyd's eyes went wide as the heavy lead ball caught him square in the throat. He dropped the shotgun, clutching his neck as he collapsed backward into the snow. Cletus stared in absolute shock. The lamb had just slaughtered the wolf. Before Cletus could raise his pistol, a massive shadow filled the doorway behind him. Adrian Gideon, covered in snow and the blood of the men below, brought the heavy steel barrel of his sharps, crashing down on the back of Cletus's skull. The big man crumpled to the floorboards, unconscious before he hit the ground. Silence descended on the cabin, save for the howling wind outside and Olivia's ragged breathing. She slowly lowered the smoking revolver, her hands shaking violently now that the adrenaline was fading. Adrian stepped over Cletus's body. He looked at Boyd, then looked at Olivia. The hardened mountain man gave a slow, solemn nod of absolute respect. "You shoot straight, Miss Miller," Adrian said quietly, taking the Colt from her trembling hands and setting it on the table. Olivia looked down at Cletus, who was groaning as blood pooled around his head. She looked up at Adrian, her eyes hardening into something as cold and unforgiving as the mountain outside. "Tie him up," Olivia ordered, her voice devoid of fear. "Use the same rope he used on me. When the storm breaks, we aren't hiding anymore. We're taking him back to Oakhaven. We're going to pay a visit to Josiah Crabbe." The mountain blizzard broke just before dawn, leaving the world buried beneath 3 feet of pristine, blinding white powder. The brutal winds that had scoured the eagle's roost faded into a heavy, frozen silence. The storm had passed, but the true reckoning was just beginning. Inside the cabin, Olivia Miller stood by the wood stove, the Colt Navy tucked securely into the waistband of her heavy wool skirt. Her ankles, though heavily bandaged and throbbing with a dull ache, held her weight. Beside her, Cletus sat on the floorboards, bound hand and foot with the very hemp rope he had used to suspend her from the sycamore tree. His face was a canvas of purple bruises, his arrogance completely shattered by the sight of Blackjack Boyd bleeding out in the snow the day prior. "It's time," Adrian Gideon rumbled, pulling his heavy buffalo coat over his broad shoulders. He checked the action on his Sharps rifle, the metallic clack echoing in the small room. "The pass to Denver is closed by the snow. The only way this ends is down in the valley." They loaded Cletus face down over the back of Blackjack Boyd's surviving horse, tying him securely to the saddle horn. Adrian lifted Olivia onto Brimstone, his large, calloused hands lingering for a brief moment on her waist. The mountain man's ice-blue eyes met hers, conveying a silent, unbreakable promise. Whatever happens down there, you won't face it alone. The descent was a slow, treacherous crawl through deep drifts and icy switchbacks. By the time they reached the valley floor, the midday sun was glaring off the snow-covered roofs of Oakhaven. The town was eerily quiet as they rode down the main street. The dead sycamore tree stood stark against the white landscape, its bare branches coated in ice. As Adrian and Olivia approached the center of town, faces began to appear in the frosted windows of the mercantile, the assay office, and the bakery. The townspeople who had averted their eyes during Olivia's torture now stared in stunned disbelief. The ghost of the high ridges had returned, and he had brought the dead girl back with him. Josiah Crabbe stepped out through the swinging doors of his saloon, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand. He was flanked by 4 hired guns, their hands hovering over their holstered revolvers. Crabbe's tailored Eastern suit looked completely out of place against the raw, frozen grit of the street. When he saw Cletus bound and bleeding over the saddle, the whiskey glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the wooden porch. "You're a long way from the timberline, mountain man," Crabbe shouted, trying to project an authority he suddenly didn't feel. "You've got no jurisdiction here. That woman is a thief, and you are harboring a fugitive." Adrian didn't stop walking until he was 30 yards from the saloon. He planted his boots in the snow, bringing the heavy Sharps rifle up to rest casually across his forearm. "I don't care much for jurisdiction, Crabbe." Adrian's voice echoed off the wooden facades, deep and resonant. "But I do care for confessions. Your boy Cletus here had a very talkative night. He detailed exactly how much you paid him to ambush Thomas Miller in the ravine. He also mentioned the forgery." Crabbe sneered, though his eyes darted nervously to his hired men. "The word of a beaten man means nothing to a judge." "You're outnumbered, Gideon. Drop the rifle, and maybe I'll let you ride back up to your cave." "He won't have to," Olivia's voice rang out, sharp and clear like cracked ice. She slid down from Brimstone's back, ignoring the flare of pain in her legs. She stepped out from behind the massive draft horse, leveling the Colt Navy directly at Crabbe's chest. The townspeople gasped. This was not the broken, screaming girl who had hung from the tree. This was a woman forged in the fires of the wilderness. "You made a mistake, Josiah," Olivia said, walking slowly forward. "You thought terror would break me, but you only stripped away my fear. Now, we are going to walk into that telegraph office. You are going to stand there while I wire Marshall Wade and Ezekiel Cross in Denver to retrieve the federal land patent for Whispering Pines. Then, you are going to sit in the jailhouse until the marshal arrives." Crabbe let out a dark, desperate laugh. "Kill them," he hissed to his men. "Kill them both." The hired guns moved to draw, but they severely underestimated the man from the high ridges. Adrian moved with a terrifying, predatory speed. He didn't use the rifle. He dropped it into the snow, drawing the twin Colt revolvers from his belt in a blur of motion. 2 deafening blasts shattered the quiet. The revolvers in the hands of Crabbe's 2 lead gunmen went spinning into the snow, their fingers shattered by Adrian's impossible marksmanship. The remaining 2 men froze, their hands hovering over their holsters, their eyes wide with terror. "Draw," Adrian whispered, the threat hanging heavy in the freezing air. "I dare you." The 2 uninjured men slowly raised their empty hands, backing away from Crabbe. They were paid to intimidate, not to die against a phantom who didn't miss. Realizing he was entirely abandoned, panic finally consumed Josiah Crabbe. He lunged for the pearl-handled revolver at his hip. Bang! It wasn't Adrian who fired. Olivia stood 30 feet away, smoke drifting from the barrel of her Colt Navy. Crabbe screamed, dropping to his knees in the snow as blood bloomed across his right shoulder. The pearl-handled revolver tumbled out of his useless, trembling hand. Olivia walked up to him, the snow crunching beneath her boots. She looked down at the man who had ordered her father's murder and orchestrated her torture. She felt no pity, only a profound, hollow closure. "Get up," she ordered coldly. "The telegraph operator is waiting." Within 2 hours, the wire was sent. Within 2 weeks, United States Marshals rode into Oakhaven, securing the federal deed from Denver and dragging Josiah Crabbe and Cletus away in heavy iron chains. The empire of mud and fear collapsed overnight. A month later, the spring thaw had begun to melt the snow around Whispering Pines. Olivia Miller stood on the porch of her father's reclaimed ranch house, watching the silver miners work the distant ridge under honest contracts. Her ankles were scarred, a permanent reminder of the sycamore tree, but she walked without a limp. She turned her gaze toward the road. Adrian Gideon was tightening the cinch on Brimstone's saddle, his heavy buffalo coat packed away for the warmer weather. He was preparing to head back to the high ridges. Olivia walked down the wooden steps, crossing the muddy yard until she stood beside the towering mountain man. "The valley gets awfully quiet when you leave, Adrian," she said softly, reaching out to rest her hand over his on the saddle leather. Adrian looked down at her, the harsh, scarred lines of his face softening. For a decade, he had believed he belonged only to the isolation of the timberline, a ghost hunting for peace he could never find. But looking into Olivia's storm-colored eyes, he realized the ghosts of his past had finally been laid to rest. "The mountains are cold, Miss Miller," Adrian rumbled, his hand turning over to gently interlock his fingers with hers. "And I reckon I've spent enough time in the snow." He unbuckled the cinch, pulling the saddle off the massive horse, choosing, for the first time in his life, to stay. If your heart was pounding through that final snowy standoff, and you loved seeing Olivia and Adrian claim their rightful frontier justice, don't ride off just yet. Smash that like button to honor the true grit of the Wild West. Share this video with anyone who loves a real, rugged romance, and subscribe for more legendary stories. The frontier is vast, and our next adventure is just over the horizon.